A faded sign still hangs above the door of the Samarkand Hotel, a relic of a grander age on a street that has long since stopped noticing it. No one has explained how so much weight can disappear without a sound, but the closer you look at that place, the more the silence itself starts to feel like an answer. Before we even begin to chase the money, we have to ask who was left standing in that room when the last light went out, and what exactly did they see. On a cool September evening in 1970, the air in London carried the usual damp promise of autumn, but inside the Samarkand Hotel at 22 Lansdowne Crescent, something far darker was settling over the rooms. Jimi Hendrix, just 27 years old, had spent his last hours in that modest flat, and by the time the sun rose on the 18th, he was already gone, rushed to St Mary Abbott's Hospital, where doctors could do nothing to bring him back. That distinction matters more than most people realise, because it quietly dismantles the lazy narrative that Hendrix was just another rock star who overdosed on the excesses of his own legend. The story that emerged from Monica Dannemann, the woman who had been with him that night, only thickened the fog of confusion. She insisted that Hendrix had not been partying wildly, that he had been shaken by a phone call from America, something about financial impropriety among his managers, and that the distress of that conversation had sent him spiralling. When the London inquest opened its proceedings, Dannemann added an even stranger detail to her account, claiming that 3 men in suits had entered Hendrix's room before his death, a story that contradicted the police report entirely and was never corroborated by any witness or piece of evidence. Whether she was telling the truth, embellishing a tragedy, or protecting someone, the uncertainty she injected into the case has never fully dissipated, and it leaves a bitter taste for anyone who wants a clean answer. But here is what the record actually shows, if you are willing to set aside the tabloid noise and look at the forensic facts. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. Edward Thomas in London, was precise about the mechanism of death. Hendrix had ingested 9 Vesperax sleeping tablets, a dose that would have sedated him deeply, and when his body tried to reject them, he choked on the result in his sleep. The pathologist found no evidence of heroin in his system at all, no needle marks that would suggest intravenous use, nothing that matched the sensationalized version of events that spread through the press within days. It was a tragic accident, a miscalculation with prescription medication, but that sober explanation has never carried the same weight as the myth of the wild guitarist who burned out in a haze of substances. So what really happened in those final hours, before the phone call, before the ambulance was called, before the silence took over? Dannemann's account of the 3 mysterious visitors remains one of the most tantalizing loose threads in the entire Hendrix story, a detail that suggests something more orchestrated than a simple overdose, perhaps even a confrontation that pushed him to take those pills in a state of panic. If the men existed, if they came to threaten him over money or contracts, then his death becomes a different kind of tragedy, one tied not to indulgence but to the cold machinery of the music business, closing in on its most valuable asset. So there he was, the most electric guitarist of his generation, a man whose sound rewired the brains of everyone who heard it, and when the coroner finally tallied up everything he owned in this world, the sum total came to barely $80,000. $80,000. That is the kind of figure that makes you stop and blink, because we all know what happened next, and it was not small. By 2023, the money machine grinding out of his legacy was pulling in more than $30 million every single year, according to Billboard and the accountants at Experience Hendrix LLC. So the question writes itself in neon. How do you go from 80 grand to 30 million a year? And where exactly was all of that missing wealth hiding for half a century? The press had a name for this bizarre financial black hole, and it was a perfect one. The missing millions, borrowed from a Hendrix song recorded in 1969, but never released until the album People, Hell and Angels, became the label slapped on the whole sordid affair. It was never just a tune, it was the title of a real-life scandal, a fortune that evaporated into thin air. The numbers behind that nickname are almost laughably grim. From 1970 all the way to 1995, the Hendrix family watched the commercial exploitation of Jimi's music generate profit after profit, and they did not see a single cent of it, not one. Every dollar flowed into the pockets of shadowy management firms and record labels with names like Are You Experienced, Limited and Octopus Music, entities that seemed to exist for the sole purpose of keeping the family at arm's length from the gold mine, as Charles R. Cross documented in his exhaustive biography room full of mirrors. You want a picture of how badly it went. Consider the case of Alan Douglas, a man described as a guitarist and a notorious thief, which is a hell of a combination, and a supposed friend of Hendrix to boot. In 1972, Douglas strolled up to the estate and handed over a check for just $750,000. In exchange, he walked away with the rights to a mountain of unreleased tape, material that independent valuations had pegged at a cool $5 million. He paid pennies on the dollar for a vault of gold, and nobody in the family had the power to stop him. And here is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because the man at the centre of the financial maze was Michael Jeffrey, Hendrix's trusted manager, the guy everyone called a friend. Years later, the diary of Eric Burdon, Hendrix's close companion, painted a darker picture. Jeffrey, it emerged, had been quietly siphoning royalty payments into secret bank accounts in Geneva, Switzerland, with the regularity of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. When Jeffrey died in 1973, every single one of those accounts was empty. Not a trace remained. So where did the money go? And who pulled the strings that left the family destitute for a quarter of a century? The answer to that question begins, as these things often do, with a document that was never supposed to exist. The will Jimi Hendrix signed in 1968 read like a setup for a tragedy. It named his manager, Michael Jeffrey, as the sole heir, with no mention of his father Al or any charity, a document so unusual that when the Washington State Supreme Court finally examined it in 1998, they threw it out as invalid. By then, the man at the centre of it all had been dead for a quarter of a century. Jeffrey died on the 5th of March 1973, when a plane he was travelling on crashed in France, taking with him any immediate answers about where the money had gone. That crash was a disaster for the estate, but it also created a bizarre legal vacuum. Jeffrey had held a 25% stake in the company that managed Hendrix's music, and with his sudden death, that share became a prize fought over by Swiss banks and the Hendrix family. The banks claimed the stake as collateral for loans Jeffrey had taken out, while the family saw it as their last chance to reclaim something that had always been theirs. For years the paperwork sat in European vaults, each side waiting for the other to blink. And here is where you start to see the real shape of the problem. It was never just about the music. It was about who controlled the paper that claimed him to own the music. To make sense of a mess like this, you have to learn to check everything, and there is a plain, practical way to do it. Start with the official financial records on sites like RIA.com or Billboard.com, where certified sales figures are published. Then search legal databases such as Westlaw or Pacer for any lawsuits filed under the artist's name, because those filings often reveal contracts the public never sees. After that, go straight to the estate's own website, experiencehendrix.com, to see what they officially claim to control. Finally, cross-check specific song titles or albums against their certification status, because a gold record is a fact, while a memory is just a feeling. Now follow that same logic back to Jeffrey. The records show a manager who flew too close to the sun and then fell out of the sky. Was it just bad luck, or was there more to it? The official report called it an accident, but the timing is almost too perfect. A man who knew where the money was buried himself. The question hangs in the air, unanswered, as the family was left to wonder what secrets went down with him. When the news of Jimi's death arrived in September 1970, he was not standing on a stage or in a recording studio. He was at home, and the grief was a physical weight that bent his frame. Yet the true nightmare only began when the lawyers started circling, because the fortune his son had generated was not in his hands, and a father's claim meant nothing against the wall of corporate contracts that had been built by men with sharper teeth. He was a janitor, essentially, a man of modest means and quiet dignity, and for the rest of his life he would joke that he was the only poor relative of a rock star on the planet. For 25 years Al watched the music of his son get sold, repackaged, licensed and exploited while he received almost nothing. The checks that did arrive were meagre, a pittance that mocked the millions piling up in accounts he couldn't touch. It was a slow, grinding torture, and the only thing that kept him moving forward was a letter from a lawyer named Lisa Sherrill, a woman who had spent years inside the record industry and knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Lisa Sherrill had seen every trick in the book, and the book was thick with the names of managers and executives who had grown fat on Jimi's genius. She found a phantom fee, a charge that had been quietly billed to Hendrix's account back in 1969, a sum so absurd and so undocumented that it gave the family the legal leverage they needed. Within 6 months, the entire case turned, and the machine that had swallowed Jimi's legacy for a quarter of a century began to crack. The judge in New York ruled that the precious master tapes held by Alan Douglas had to be returned to the Hendrix family. But here is the cruel punchline. The original masters for Electric Ladyland had already vanished, gone into a hole that was never dug up. Al Hendrix won, and the victory was total, a stunning reversal that gave him control over his son's estate and an annual stipend of $400,000 from the very empire that had shut him out. An Indiana University study later calculated that the average estate fight for a deceased rock star drags on for 14 years, but the Hendrix case ran 25, a record that now sits in law school textbooks as a cautionary tale about what happens when greed meets grief. It was a triumph, but it was also a tragedy, because the man who had finally won the prize had to ask the same question 1,000 times. What took so long, and what did it cost him? The answer, he learned, was measured in years he would never get back. For Al, the money was never the point. The point was that his son's music would finally be protected by the only people who had ever loved him unconditionally. The woman who answered that question was Jimi Hendrix, the granddaughter of Al Hendrix, and the niece of Jimi. Since 1995, she has run Experience Hendrix LLC with an iron grip, becoming the most powerful figure in the business of rock legacy preservation. Rolling Stone named her the most powerful woman in the industry in 2010, a title she earned not by performing music but by controlling every note of it that reaches the public. Under her watch, the estate transformed from a battlefield of legal wreckage into a fortress of commercial dominance. But holding that fortress has meant facing down a parade of strangers who claimed a piece of the bloodline. In 2002, a 35-year-old woman named Tamika stepped forward with a story that made tabloids shiver. She claimed to be Jimi Hendrix's biological daughter, conceived with a New York woman named Diana Carpenter. Her assertion was specific, emotional, and backed by nothing but testimony. The estate responded the only way it could, by demanding DNA evidence. The test came back negative. Tamika's claim collapsed within months, and she disappeared from the public record, leaving behind only the uncomfortable reminder that fame invites fraud. The New York Post covered the story with barely concealed glee, but for the family it was just another wound. A woman named Eva Sundquist had tried the same thing years earlier. She was German, and she insisted her mother had a brief relationship with Hendrix in Stockholm, Sweden. Her story was detailed, vivid, and utterly false in the eyes of the law. A DNA test in 1994 concluded with a negative match, a verdict that The Guardian reported with the quiet finality of a door closing. Those two failed claims left only one officially recognised child of Jimi Hendrix, and that child was never proven to exist. He was a man with no confirmed heirs, and yet people kept crawling out of the woodwork wanting to be his son or daughter. Why would anyone invent such a thing? Because the payout, if successful, would be astronomical. Here is how you verify a claim like that, and it matters because the method is brutally simple. First, you check local court records, searching for family names and any filings related to paternity. Second, you find at least 3 separate news reports from 3 different outlets covering the DNA results, because a single source is just gossip with a byline. Third, you cross-reference biographical details, the claimant's birthplace, the timeline of Hendrix's tours, against the official record. Fourth, you resist every urge to make an emotional judgment, because the law does not care about conviction, it cares about evidence. Those 4 steps would have saved Tamika and Eva years of public humiliation. They would have saved the estate millions in legal fees. They would have spared everyone the spectacle. Jimi Hendrix learned that lesson when she was just 12 years old. She sat in a room with her father Al as he wept in front of an old radio, listening to the news of Jimi's death. He turned to her and said, "You see, people only come to us when they are gone." She made a promise that night that she would one day reclaim everything her uncle had built. In 1995, she won the biggest estate case in music history, and she has spent the decades since guarding that victory. Every false heir, every dubious claim, every con artist who smelled money in the Hendrix name has met the same wall of legal steel. So who really owns the legacy of Jimi Hendrix? A woman who was never his daughter, never his wife, but who loved him enough to fight a war for his memory. That is the strangest inheritance of all. By 2010, the scale of the loss had crystallized into a single staggering figure. Rolling Stone, in its feature on the boldest estates in music, estimated that the Hendrix family had bled out roughly $500 million in uncollected royalties and squandered opportunities, a sum large enough to have placed Jimi among the wealthiest artists who ever lived. Every bad contract, every hidden account, every silent partner had taken its slice until the pile was gone. But then the arithmetic began to move in the opposite direction. Jimi Hendrix understood the true weight of what she was guarding, and in 2014 she proved it to the entire industry. She told the Los Angeles Times that she had turned down a private investment fund's offer of $100 million for the complete music catalogue, a figure that would have made most heirs weep with gratitude. She refused it because she knew the real value sat far beyond what any number on a check could convey. The estate was not a relic to be sold off. It was a machine engineered for perpetual motion. The engine of that machine lies in the vault. Experience Hendrix LLC currently controls more than 300 hours of unreleased tape, including roughly 80 fully finished songs that the public has never heard. A hoard that the New Yorker described as a goldmine for record labels. One of the great stories buried in that collection concerns the track Gypsy Blood, recorded in full for the planned third album, only for a sound engineer to hide the master tapes because he did not believe the royalties would ever reach him. The reels sat hidden until 2018, when the estate finally located them in a warehouse in Tokyo and released them to the world. Half a century after the sessions, the music still had the power to make headlines. There is a lesson in that vault, one that any storyteller can steal. To build a compelling financial narrative out of a lawsuit, you start with a hard number from an official source, then name the people who held the rights and the companies that swallowed the money. You describe a physical place, a Swiss bank vault or a storage unit, to give the loss a location, and you end with the resurrection. The New York Times and Columbia University have both pointed to this exact structure as the template for making money disappear and reappear on the page. The catalogue now generates tens of millions every year. The unreleased tapes stretch decades into the future, and the brand carries a weight that no amount of bad management could ever erase. So the question that lingers is not whether the empire survived. It is what Jimi himself would have made of a legacy worth more in death than it ever was in life. The room above the Samarkand Hotel is still, but the question it left behind has never quieted. Did Jimi Hendrix ever know what he was really worth? The fame was blinding, the music eternal. Yet the fortune slipped through his fingers while he was still breathing, and the lesson sits heavy for anyone who ever assumed that brilliance pays for itself. By 2021, Forbes ranked him the 7th highest-earning dead artist, with $23 million in a single year, a resurrection built not by chance but by the relentless stewardship his own lifetime never had. Now Universal Music Group and Experience Hendrix LLC have announced plans for 7 unreleased albums, projecting $100 million in revenue within 5 years, and it is almost unbearable to imagine what that kind of care could have done for the man himself. There is also a $1 million royalty check that MTV reported in 2020, locked in a Swiss bank vault for 30 years, waiting for a beneficiary no one could ever confirm, a ghost of the golden age that still refuses to be spent. The sum of it all is that the same hands that created the music were never allowed to protect it, and the tragedy repeats itself whenever an artist trusts more than they verify. So if this story stirs something, do not let it end here. Charles R. Cross's Room Full of Mirrors is the closest you will get to the man behind the myth, and it deserves your time. And then tell me below what you would do with a legacy nobody taught you to manage, because that is the real question we are all still trying to answer.